Well, hello, everybody. My name is Robert Puentes. I am the president and CEO of the ENO Center for Transportation here in Washington, and I want to welcome you to the latest in our series of ENO webinars. As we all know, the war in Ukraine has touched almost every corner of the world in so many different ways. Of paramount concern, obviously, is the massive humanitarian crisis that they're facing now. But in addition, are the impacts on the global economy, particularly in the commercial aviation sector. And so today we're going to focus on those impacts in several different dimensions. And to help us do that, I'm very happy to welcome Jens Flottau. Jens is based in Frankfurt, Germany. He is the executive editor at the Aviation Week Network, where he leads a global team of journalists who are covering commercial aviation. And we want to engage with you all in the audience as well. So during the course of this webinar, please feel free to use the questions function on the webinar website. We'll take questions. We'll kind of address this throughout the time we have here. The idea is to keep this more kind of conversational and free moving. So if you have questions on anything, please feel free to use that function on the website. You don't have to wait till the end. You can ask questions anytime. So with that, let's just jump in. Jens, we know that the aviation impacts of the war in Ukraine are multifaceted. So let's just start really big and really broad. What's the magnitude of the war on aviation globally? How big of an impact is it having on commercial air transportation?
Unfortunately, my answer is it depends on what you're looking at. So it's complicated. But the broad overview is there are obviously short-term and long-term issues, and there's direct and indirect effects. Broadly speaking, I would say that the non-Russian airlines are more affected by the indirect effects, such as like high fuel prices and stuff. And that's obviously a huge impact. Coming back to your original question, and the Russian carriers have a more immediate, a direct effect as a consequence of these sanctions. But if I'm going to give you an overview of who else is touched, obviously the big headline grabbing element is the lessors, the leasing industry. Russian airlines have basically leased their entire fleet. That's kind of caused by history. They came out of the Soviet era in the early 90s. Didn't have a lot of money to buy aircraft, so they started leasing and stuck to it. So almost the entire fleet is now leased. Almost the entire fleet was registered in Bermuda. A tiny fraction of them was registered in Ireland, and a large chunk of the fleet, between 500 and 600 aircraft, were owned by Western lessors. Now, of course, as part of the sanctions, the EU and the US require those lessors to terminate those leases as of March 28th, which they did. But most of the aircraft are still in Russia because, as some of you may have seen, President Putin signed a law that allowed Russian airlines to re-register their aircraft to the Russian registry, and not only that, but also register them as their property. So we did a cover story in Aviation Week last week and called it Putin's big plane robbery, because that's in effect what it is. The Russian government decided it's okay to steal more than 500 aircraft, valued something around $13 billion. So obviously that's a big number, but one has to say that the lessors have most of the lessors don't have a large exposure to Russia. So even those that are worst affected by this can probably deal with it. On the Russian airline side, that's another dramatic element. Of course, they cannot lease aircraft, as I just said. They cannot fly internationally. They also have no more access to spares. The Boeing and Airbus representatives cannot even pick up the phone and answer questions from Russian airlines that they may have on how to operate their aircraft. And you can feel it even now. Pobieda, which is a low-cost carrier owned by Aeroflot, and is the third largest airline in the country, just confirmed this week that they are grounding 16 aircraft. That's about a third of their fleet, just because they have run out of spares, and they'll put them on the ground, and as long as they don't have access to spares. But that situation will get worse, and the operational fleet will get smaller. If you look at, we can go into more details of that, of course, including, I'd be very happy to talk about the revival of Soviet-era aircraft that Russia is now looking at. But just maybe for the start, also a look at the non-Russian airlines, at the Europeans in particular, and the American carriers. Obviously, a big theme is the steep rise in oil prices that comes just after COVID, when airlines are highly, highly indebted as never before. They were hoping to be able to repair their balance sheets based on strong demand, which still exists, luckily for them. But now, of course, costs are rising a lot. Inflation, fuel, and that makes that recovery a lot harder than they had hoped. Question is, will higher prices, higher fares that are kind of unavoidable in these circumstances, will they hurt demand? And for now, in Europe at least, the answer is no, not yet. Demand is very strong, continues to be strong. There has been a period of maybe a week or so after the war had started in late February when people appeared to be hesitating to book, just because everyone was concerned about what was going on, naturally. But that seems to have tapered off a bit. People are more confident that it's okay to fly, to plan holidays, whatever. So it's, in a way, we're in a wait and see mode as far as that element is concerned. I guess I'll leave it at that, and we can go into other stuff in the Q&A.
I really appreciate that. And for folks who haven't seen it, I certainly would encourage you to take a look at the Aviation Week cover story that Jens mentioned on Putin's decisions in the industry. Very, very enlightening. It's very helpful for me. Let's talk about a little bit about your last comment there on travel demand, and particularly the impact on global travel has been, as you said, maybe haven't seen those impacts yet, but the Russian airspace itself is obviously quite large, and flights pass through Russian airspace all the time. Is all that airspace restricted now, and what is the impact on travel patterns been from airlines given these restrictions and these?
Yeah, so the entire airspace is closed, and it's large, as you know, it's a large country. There is one element that makes this more manageable, which is, again, COVID. Because of COVID and because of all the limitations that are still put in place in Asia, a lot of the European and the US airlines have, and of course the Asian airlines in particular, have cut back on international service. There is essentially hardly any international service into China. In Southeast Asia, some countries are just about to reopen. Singapore has started, and so on. But for a lot of the carriers, the volume that is going into Asia is about 5 to 10% of what it was 3 years ago, and that has several consequences. One is obviously what's happening in Russia now. The fact that you have to avoid Russian and Siberian airspace doesn't add that much cost in the big picture, even though those flights that are operating are becoming a lot more expensive because you have to add sometimes 3-4 hours of flight time. So in the big picture, it's manageable. But as the opening occurs, and everyone hopes that even China opens up, hopefully by the end of this year at the latest, but who knows? That problem will become much larger in two ways. It's more flights that are affected, and there's also constraints on the airways, because everyone's going to use the same airways around Russia. So those will quickly become congested, and that will be a real challenge as long haul travel returns.
And a couple of questions coming. Can you describe, maybe shed a little more information on the subject of overflight rights? What does that mean broadly, and how has that been impacted since the war began?
So basically, I mean, as part of the sanctions, the Europeans kind of banned Russian airlines from using European airspace, and other countries followed. The US has done the same. Russia has, as a kind of as retaliation, has banned airlines from those countries to use Russian airspace. Now, if you look at the world map, Russia is in the middle of routes between Europe and Southeast Asia, and since aircraft tend to favor airline planners tend to favor Great Circle routes, which are the shortest distance between 2 points on the globe. They are typically going over Russia when you fly from Europe to Asia, and vice versa. Also from Southeast Asia to the U.S. East Coast, that's that often goes through Siberian airspace. So even markets that are nothing to do with Russia are affected. If you look a little bit more closely, it's a huge problem for a carrier like Finnair, which has a hub in Helsinki and is specialized on Asia traffic, just because it can pull all this feeder traffic from Europe into Helsinki and then go on to Asia. If you're a carrier that is very exposed to the North Atlantic, you don't care much. It doesn't affect you much. But United, Delta, that have that used to have at least a lot of flights into Asia, have the same problem. They have to fly longer. It's more expensive, and it's a particular problem for cargo as well. So we already have this because of the broken supply chains everywhere. Demand for cargo is huge. Because there are less passenger aircraft flying long haul, capacity is constrained. Now you have those relatively few all cargo aircraft flying longer routes, which means they can take less cargo because they're range limited now. So capacity is even more constrained, and for the shippers, it means probably even higher prices, at least for the time being.
We had some questions on air cargo, and so you let's jump into that. So are there key operational differences between passenger travel and air cargo? Does it have different impacts on different places? I think Anchorage, Alaska, for a long time was a place that was a major cargo hub. Do you see changes in kind of that map because of the difference between?
That question came up over the past few weeks, whether Anchorage would benefit from this, because people would go via Anchorage even for passenger aircraft, like in the good old days when the aircraft didn't have the range and people were flying DC-10s from via Anchorage to Japan. So far, that hasn't happened to a great extent. What's happened more is that people have just left cargo on the ground, reduced the payload, tried to fly the existing routes, the previous routes, just with less cargo. But for the customers, the effect is the same. The capacity is reduced. Prices are, they're already high, but I don't see how high they cannot become even higher. But basically, I mean, from an aircraft operations point of view, both passenger airlines and cargo airlines are facing the same basic dilemma.
And the Finnair anecdote is a really interesting one. Obviously, some airlines and places are impacted different than others. I think in Aviation Week you wrote that they're going over the North Pole now, and all the different routes.
They used to go over the North Pole decades ago, and there are specific procedures. You have to certify your aircraft, you have to certify your pilots, you have to follow certain protocols, and they didn't need that anymore because the routes changed. They were flying over Siberia. Now they've gone back into it, and it's an operational challenge. It's for pilots. It's quite an experience to do that. The planning is very, very complicated. As I said, it adds several hours to Finnair's flights to Tokyo, and you can only afford so much of that. So while they are continuing to fly to Tokyo, they've temporarily dropped Osaka, for instance, just because it's not paying off.
And are there impacts then on personnel, on aircraft personnel? I would guess if there's longer flights, then you need more pilots, or maybe more crew. Are you seeing that kind of a?
It really differs. It really depends on the airline. Every airline has its own rules that are agreed on in collective bargaining agreements, and how you operate aircraft. Some airlines are, even across the Atlantic, are using 3 pilots. I guess the US carriers have the 8-hour stick time rule, which means you can't work more than 8 hours, and if the flight's longer than 8 hours, you have to take a third pilot. The rules differ in Europe. There's longer flights just with 2 pilots. But yes, on the Asia flights, I do know that some of the airlines are now just adding a third or even a fourth pilot when these flights get excessively long. The Finnair flights, they are being operated with 4 pilots. Yeah.
Is that problematic? Are they experiencing personnel shortages or challenges getting those folks?
No, I mean, again, COVID comes into play. Most airlines have lots of long haul pilots with not much to do. They're happy to fly. The short haul domestic has recovered to whatever it is, 85% in the summer over here. Sometimes airlines are operating at levels above pre-COVID demand, 2019 demand, but that's not true for long haul. So there's still a large, and in general there are still way too many long haul pilots for the level of demand that we currently experience.
Very interesting. A couple of questions here on safety. Let me just to summarize, there's obviously safety risks flying over conflict zones. Are there other safety related issues that folks should be concerned about? You mentioned you didn't see the drop in demand, so maybe folks aren't experiencing that. But are there safety issues that should be talked about other than the obvious things about flying around conflict areas?
I don't see those, to be honest. I couldn't think of anything that strikes me. The conflict zones, yeah, you mentioned them. You have to fly around them. But even that is complicated. It's because we're not only talking about Ukraine and the vicinity of Ukraine. Don't forget people flying to Southeast Asia also cannot fly over Afghanistan. So there's already two countries that are right in the on the way to Singapore, to India, and so on. That when the political situation was different, would have been flown over because it's the shortest route. That's not happening. But no, as far as safety, no, I don't see any particular concern.
One more on the travel demand changes. Obviously the airline can't decide from one day to the next the route they're going to fly. It has to all be regulated. And so how long does that take? Is there a process that the Finnair or somebody would have to go through in order to change the routine flight routes?
I mean, they're really changed every day, as you say. If you take the North Atlantic, for example, an airline, the pilots would call in for duty in the morning, and they would look at the prevailing weather, the winds in particular, and then you would go. Sometimes you go very far north, sometimes you go very far south, just to avoid the headwinds. And when you come back from North America to Europe, you're looking for the strongest tailwinds. In order to be able to save fuel or fly fast and so on. So that's happening every day. But of course, with Asia now, an entire block in the middle is prohibited, and that doesn't leave too many routes open. And it's manageable right now, as I said, because there's not that much traffic. But once that changes, it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be problematic.
So on the sanctions question, so this question comes in. Until last year, civil aviation has been relatively spared from EU sanction packages, with some exceptions. Is civil aviation becoming a toy of politics, as has been described in some airline CEOs?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I find it hard to describe as a toy in this context. I mean, the idea is to hurt Russia as much as possible, and civil aviation is one element in this. And the measures that they are taking seem to be very effective, because over a very relatively short period of time, people are going. We're seeing the Russian airline industry being taken down. At least large parts of it. The fact that they can't fly internationally means a third of the capacity cannot be deployed. The fact that there's no spares will automatically diminish the fleet. So it's a very effective tool. Of course, it's politics, but this is what this is all about, right?
And so, in terms of the aircraft themselves, I mean, you mentioned that the commercial aircraft are being held in Russia; they're being stayed there. Is it impossible now to even think that those aircraft will eventually be returned to their owners? Has that changed fundamentally? How does that play out even in the future?
Very good question. I mean, the going in assumption that the leasing industry has right now is that those aircraft are lost. Because obviously there's no one sees any short-term solution to this, an agreement on peace or anything that would resolve this. Even on the aviation level, the other question is even when those aircraft might be returned, and there's a very, very big question mark. You don't know the condition in which they're in. What the Russian carriers will be doing is they will put some aircraft on the ground and use them for spares. So there'll be aircraft without engines, aircraft without whatever pieces of the pieces of equipment in the cockpit, computers, pieces of cabin. So their value will diminish greatly. Furthermore, we've been talking about safety. Every change to an aircraft has to be properly documented. You have to, as the owner or as the future buyer of an aircraft, you have to be able to see that the documentation is proper, that the parts that have been used have been certified properly, that all the maintenance has been performed. As a lessor of an aircraft in Russia, you don't know that. So what we're seeing already now is that the lessors are putting in claims with their own insurers for to recover the value of the fleet. But the assumption is now basically that the entire fleet will have to be written off.
Enormous impact, obviously, to these.
It's an enormous impact. It's 500 aircraft. Yet there's different degrees of exposure. AirCap, which is the biggest lessor of the world, has 135 aircraft in Russia. They've just put out a claim for over $3.5 billion to their insurers. But it sounds like a large sum. It is a large sum, but it's only 5% of their fleet. So in that sense, that's painful, but it's not going to break the company. Others have been more cautious in the past, where they have exposure of 1 or 2%, which is more manageable. So painful, but manageable.
Got it. So a couple folks are wondering on the for lack of a better, the energy and the environmental kind of components to this. The EU's reliance on Russian energy is well known. Can you think of aviation-related environmental impacts that are emerging now here from the crisis? Either from, you talked about higher energy prices. I mean, airlines are, I guess, using more fuel, running longer routes. So is there a large-scale environmental concerns we should think about here in the context of the EU's reliance on Russian energy?
Yeah, I mean, of course, they're using more fuel on those flights that are affected. So in that sense, there is an effect. The higher fuel prices will hopefully have a positive environmental effect, if you will, in the sense that you really only fly those routes that make sense. If you're going back to 2018, 2019, the boom years of air travel in the United States and Europe, I thought some of what happened then, when oil was cheap, when interest rates were low, they're still low today, but they were low then, when all the pieces fell into place, there was some excessive behavior in terms of capacity. People were flying too much, and so from an environmental point of view, what's happening now is well, positive is the wrong word, because I mean there's nothing positive about a war. I would say an indirect effect of this is that people in Europe understand that the transition to renewable energies has to be accelerated. That this is not an aviation topic per se. In aviation, it's harder because of technology, because of the fact that you have to travel by air and you have to carry the fuel somehow, and that Jet A fuel cannot be easily replaced. But overall, if you look at it, big picture wise, I think one positive outcome might be that the transition to renewable energies is accelerated. But that's a comment that is not particular to aviation.
Sure, understand. A couple of folks are wondering about back to this other point about specific impacts in different places. You talked about the impacts on China, which again, staggering numbers. You cited 5 to 10% travel demand back. Are there other impacts for places, particularly these long haul flights to places like Japan, India? Folks are wondering about. You mentioned the Finnair flights that have to go around. Are there other significant impacts on particular places that we should think about or know about? I guess.
Yeah. So the routes, you just basically have to look at the world map. The routes that are affected are Southeast Asia to North America, Southeast Asia to Europe, Northeast Asia to Europe. That includes China. That includes Japan. But even shorter routes that you wouldn't necessarily think of are problematic these days. I talked to the CEO of Air Baltic, which is the Latvian airline based in Riga, and they have one long-haul flight, which is from Riga to Dubai. It's a 7-hour flight typically. They use that to connect with Emirates and to provide an Asia connection. That 7-hour flight is now an 8-hour flight, and puts that aircraft right at the edge of its range capabilities. It's an Airbus A220, which isn't really built for long haul. So yeah, there's a lot of routes that are affected, a lot of markets. Yeah.
So then I think maybe related, but folks then want to know about individual impacts. This might be a little bit outside of stuff you've been writing about for the magazine, but the impacts on other modes. I mean, have you seen that travel demand has changed for either more emphasis on rail travel or maritime for shipping, or have those larger impacts started to emerge yet, given the challenges that are facing on the aviation side?
So on shipping would obviously be cargo, and we haven't seen any dip in demand. Quite the opposite. It's going up, and for the reasons I described. That was, that trend is continuing. Higher demand, higher fares, even less capacity now. As far as passenger traffic moving to rail, no, to be honest, we haven't seen that yet. Some of it was simply due to the fact that people have booked holidays over the past few months when it wasn't clear that there was going to be a war in Europe. So that those bookings are in place. But I've asked a few of the airlines over the past few days, what have you seen? Are bookings dropping off? And as I said, they've dropped for a few days, but they're back to where they expected them to be now. And I think longer term, the question will be more about, what will inflation do? What will that mean to people's income, to people's willingness to spend money on travel? And of course, if you're a family, then it's more affordable to take your car and go somewhere closer, or take a train and go somewhere closer than to buy 5 airline tickets. That's a concern for not the Easter period or the early part of the summer, because those bookings are there already. But for August, September, October, and so on, the airlines are concerned that as if inflation stays that high, then that will probably dampen demand. But at the same time, airlines are more reliant on an extended summer because of what they've gone through over the past 2 years.
So is that what we should be looking for in the next? So maybe not any short-term impacts for the reasons that you mentioned. I think flights are booked and people have already made plans. We should be looking 5-6 months into the year.
Yeah, I think I mean, for some of these issues, it's really early days, and they just are about to begin to play out. But there's also, I mean, after 2 years of the pandemic, and many of the viewers will probably be able to confirm that people are really, really eager to travel again. I mean, you can probably, Rob, you can look at yourself, or I can see it in my own professional life. I haven't been out there doing trips for business for the magazine essentially for 2 years. Now my schedule is full from this week until October. So that people will probably still do some of that as long as it's possible. For private travel, it's a question of cost.
And the commercial travel or the business-related travel is what we saw got hit pretty hard, especially during the pandemic. And you're right. I think it is starting to pick up again. And just judging from life here on the streets of Washington and in the airports, we do see it ticking up for sure. We're almost out of time. Just a couple of quick questions here. That this is a good one that's come in. How have orders for new aircraft been affected? Have we seen associated effects on jobs, manufacturing, capital investments, things like that for new orders for aircraft?
Well, the Russia situation, that's still too early to say. There has been a huge effect from COVID. I mean, orders are way down. They have come back somewhat for narrow-body aircraft, Airbus A320s, Boeing 737s. Some say to a surprising extent. They're also a reflection of demand. But as far as long-haul travel and long-haul aircraft is concerned, we're still, I would say, years away from a true recovery. If you look at what Airbus and Boeing used to produce, the kinds of volumes of aircraft, Boeing built 14 787s a month. Airbus built, I believe, also 14 A330s and 10 A350s. Then Boeing had 5 or 6 777s a month, plus some 747s. So we were talking like more than 30 wide-body aircraft every month, and we're down to less than 10 at this point. So it's painful for the OEMs, and it's not over yet. But it's got nothing to do with Russia. It's all COVID.
Certainly not enhanced by these challenges. Then one last question. Then, so looking back, then you of course correctly mentioned that there's nothing positive here. What's going on with the war? What lessons then should we take from this in the future? I mean, hopefully we don't see anything with the magnitude of this. This is certainly a gigantic crisis. But what lessons from what's happened here can the aviation industry globally take from what's happened in the war in Ukraine?
I think a lot of people have to take a hard look at their risk assessments. I mean, that's particularly true for lessors. Do you really want to place a lot of aircraft in a country that has behaved like this, or in countries that may behave like that? That's probably the main takeaway I would see. But again, coming out of COVID, airlines have learned the hard way already that they really need to be flexible. They have to be able to adapt capacity quickly, reduce staffing, to agree to part-time deals with their workers, to keep them on board when demand picks up again. Be flexible in the fleet planning. Not be cautious. No airline has ever gone bankrupt because it had too few aircraft or too small aircraft, but a lot of airlines have gone bankrupt because they had too many. So be cautious, look at risk. That's, I think, where the learnings should be in.
Sure. Makes a lot of sense. And again, especially as you mentioned, and I hadn't thought about it really until we started this conversation, the bright connection between what we just have gone through over the last few years with COVID and how disruptive that has been, that there's obviously a relationship between those conversations. And the big impacts, as you mentioned, places like China, but it's hard not to be struck by the resiliency of the sector and just how much demand is still out there right now.
Yeah, and I just talked to the CEO of Lufthansa, Carsten Spohr, yesterday, and he said, you know what, Corona was somewhat of a training camp for us. We learned the hard way how to deal with these things, and if we didn't if we hadn't had Corona, it would have been a lot more difficult for us to deal with this now. But we're kind of used to crisis management now, and well, there's another one. It's terrible. It's painful. It's devastating from a humanitarian point of view. But at least we know how to deal with this now.
Interesting. Yeah, certainly. As you said, nothing good, but some lessons, and it's silver lining, I guess, to all of this. But thank you so much for sharing these insights with us. It's a very fast-moving thing. There's judging from the questions, it's multifaceted, but a lot of interest in what's going on. I really want to appreciate you for taking the time, Jens, and for sharing these insights with us. And thank you, everybody, for your participation and for joining us here on this webinar today. If you'd like more information about Eno, including our upcoming webinars, our events, our classes, and our coursework, you can check out our website at www.enotrans.org. While you're there, you can check out and subscribe to Eno Transportation Weekly, and also our upcoming classes, our Transportation Mid-Manager and our Senior Executive classes. So again, Jens, just once again, just thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. I hope you and your family are well. Stay well.
Thank you.
And to everybody else, thank you for joining us today. Be well, everybody.